There we go. Thank you, Luciano. So we are here in this series of interviews called Experience Creators. Our guest today is Sérgio Figueira. He's a Portuguese writer and historian with a master in contemporary history and a clear passion for Porto. We're going to discover the city where he was born. With a career that went through journalism and law, currently dedicating himself to writing. Sergio walks every day with tourists discovering Portugal's history with Porto as a background. In this interview, we will discover 2,500 years of history of this city, the legends of the origin of Porto wine, and the story of an empire that in the 15th century ruled a big part of the world. So, Sergio, how are you?
Hello, Esteban. Hi to everybody. Thanks for joining us today. I'm very excited to do this interview with you, Esteban. I'm doing very well, thank you, and I hope you are too, and everybody who's joined us today.
Okay, very well. Just for everybody to know, the new ones that enter right now, Sergio is in Porto in Portugal, and I am in Buenos Aires in Argentina. So, Sergio, please, let's clarify something that I always find a little bit tricky. Is it Porto? Is it Porto? Is it in Portuguese, in English? How is that?
Okay, it's a very good question to start. So it's Porto. The designation of Porto started with the British. Also, the Spanish use a lot of Porto, Ciudad de Oporto, the city of Oporto. But the designation really is Porto, internationally known, especially by the British and the Spanish, as Oporto.
Great. As we have that very clarified, tell me a little bit about your childhood in this nice city.
Sorry, I couldn't understand.
Tell me a little bit about your childhood in this city.
Okay, so I was born in Porto.
Yeah.
It was just a normal childhood. You know, Porto suddenly changed a lot in the last, especially in the last 20 years. But, you know, it's a very old city. I was lucky to grow up in a quiet neighborhood, not far from the center. So I did basic school and high school in Porto, and then I went to the university in Coimbra, which is a city south of Porto, like 100 kilometers of Porto. You know, it's like the most ancient university of Portugal to do law school. But basically, you know, I had a very normal childhood here in the city of Porto.
Great. And why law school?
Well, at the time, as I think it happens with a lot of teenagers, I wasn't really sure of what I wanted to study. You know, I had this very romantic idea, and I think that's one of the reasons I chose law school. You know, coming from TV series and movies and dramas, a very romantic idea of, you know, a lawyer being kind of a hero defending the helpless, you know, people.
Totally.
Of course, you know, reality turned out to be very, very different. But I knew I wanted to do something that had to do with communication. I wasn't really aware of that at the time, even though I already had also a big attraction for communication and journalism. But, you know, eventually I decided to go and study, to do law school. At the time, there was still no law school in Porto, and being faced with the fact of going to Lisbon or Coimbra, my family, of course, thought it would be better for me to go to Coimbra because I was closer to home, you know, and Lisbon was like the capital, and there were too probably many temptations. I don't know. Eventually,
For a young
they said,
boy.
"No, it's better for you to go to Coimbra." And Coimbra is a very special, has a very special ambience because it's a small city. You know, it's very much marked by the university, so the students have a very strong presence in the city. So I studied there for 5 years. You know, it was a good time, but very soon things started to change for me professionally.
Okay, Sergio, I stopped you there because I found it while I was looking out about Porto and Portugal in general. This phrase that maybe is related with what you were talking about, that Lisbon has fun, Coimbra studies, Braga prays, and Oporto works, or Porto, as you said there. Is that right?
Yeah, well, you know, I'm sure my friends from Lisbon
Let's not ask
won't
them
mind
to
me
right
saying.
now.
Uh, it's of course it's a cliche, but I mean there was always this idea. It's very interesting that in Portugal you hear a lot of people being from the north, but you don't really hear someone saying, "Oh, I'm from the south,"
Aha.
meaning North of Portugal has a very strong identity, and I think it has to do with the fact that we can say the nation, the country began in the north of Portugal. So
Mm.
dating back, you know, to the fightings with the Moorish people and the origins of Portugal really started at what was known as the Condado Portucalense, the Portuguese county.
Uh-huh.
So in a way, you know, all these things always have a reason, and history surely, you know, answers a lot of these questions.
Very nice. So, what about when you ended studying in Coimbra, your law school? What's next?
Okay, so when I was still in university, I found out that, you know, I started wondering if law school was really, you know, if the University of Law was really for me, because I very quickly found that probably, you know, there was some things that I was also very much interested in as
Uh-huh.
communication and journalism. And I started, you know, working in a local radio station um, as a journalist, and something happened here. No.
Yeah, I'm trying that's okay. I don't know what happened, but let's keep on going.
So I started doing some work as a journalist. Actually, you know, I decided, you know, I want to be a journalist as well. I
Uh-huh.
was almost at the end of my degree in law, and I told my family, you know, that um, maybe I wasn't too sure of finishing law school. And of course, they
Ah.
were in panic because they told me, "What do you mean? You're almost done with law school, and now you want to become a journalist?
Why
Okay,
do
you can try to do both, but please finish law school."
why do parents always panic in those situations, right?
I understand, you know, I understand. Luckily, I mean, it was a good idea that I did finish the course. You know, it gave me a very solid background for other things I wanted to do.
Uh-huh.
But so going back to your question, already before I finished law school, I started doing interviews because I decided one day you know, I wanted to work on a radio station. So what I
Ah.
did was that I went to the local radio station in Porto. I knocked on the door. I asked the director to talk with him, and and I said that I wanted to work on the radio.
Very
So he
nice.
looked at me and he said, "You know what? Working on the radio is not as easy as you might think it is. So if you do want to do that, you know, you better come here with a solid idea, put that idea on paper, and
Uh-huh.
let's see what happens."
It's very that is very interesting, Sergio, to know because It's very interesting when you want to show something to other people. I have learned this the last 2 years, especially.
Sorry, I'm listening a bit
Sorry.
not very
Now,
well. Is your sound level?
let's see. Da, da, da. Let's see if I can.
Sounds good on our end.
Yeah, I can hear you too quite fine.
Okay. Do you hear me okay, Sergio?
A bit lowered level.
Let's see.
Probably because in the meantime, I got an incoming call. So it might have changed something because of that.
Well,
but let's go on.
Okay, if you have any trouble, we try to fix it. But I was wondering that this idea of journalism is not only that you like to express yourself, right? But also you have the idea of looking for that information. Now you have like the curiosity. It's not just speaking out. It's just wait. I'm going to speak out when I find something interesting, right?
Absolutely. And I think that's that curiosity that brought me exactly to the place where I am today.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Where we are going now. Tell me something that I found very interesting. Is it true that you are somehow related with space tourism?
Yes, it is. We've talked before this live interview, and as I mentioned to you before, I guess in a way I have a very peculiar CV, if you want, because I've done lots of different things. I've worked as a journalist, as a lawyer, communication consultant, in tourism area, then started studies in history. I published some books, so I'm a writer. In a way, at some point in my life, I thought, it's weird because, I don't really have that kind of those curriculums, professional careers that people start doing one thing, and they just keep on going on that direction. I remember, it was when I started actually working on that project of space tourism, the general manager told me, your curriculum is very unusual, but I like that. I guess nowadays it's much more appreciated, people that have very different careers, experiences in a lot of different areas, because I think in the end, it gives you a broader experience, and it certainly, it's better for your professional life. But I guess some years ago, people had a very much more, closed or narrow mandate, if you wanted, in terms of careers, professional careers. So if you were looking for someone, who was just going to be your regular plain lawyer, that was not the case. I certainly not, because, I did lots of different things. I always enjoyed taking on new challenges. So going back to your question and space tourism, what happened was that, basically I worked for some years in my life as I started as a lawyer and a journalist at the same time. Then I gave up journalism to concentrate on law and, business managing as well. And then I had an international experience, meaning I went to Holland and I lived there for 3 years, where I worked in an international law firm. When I came back to Portugal, and I was looking for, so what am I going to do next year? And I decided that I didn't want to do any longer law. So I was looking for a new challenge. And I knew it had to be different. And one day I read this ad. They were looking for a project manager in Portugal for a new project that had to do with space tourism.
Sorry, Sergio,
was like,
I confess that the first time I've heard about that you told me, I thought it was metaphorical space tourism. But actually,
no, it was
literally.
No, it was literally. So this was like 2000, and so it was 12 years ago already.
Yeah.
And so I saw this ad, and then I realized there was this new project that Sir Richard Branson, the guy who founded Virgin, had started. And he wanted to make space flights available in the future for everybody. So he started the first private project of space tourism.
Yeah.
And so they were looking for a project manager in Portugal. They had a partner in Portugal, a big company working in tourism area. And I applied for the job. I had no idea when I went for the interview. So I was selected for the interview, and eventually I got the job. And it was a very interesting experience because, first of all, it was my first experience not really, but it was my main experience in the tourism area, even though it was space tourism. But from there, I moved to other areas. It was very interesting because it was building up a new project in Portugal. Basically, we were to be the representatives of Virgin Galactic, the company within Virgin. They have several companies like Virgin Atlantic, the Virgin Railways, whatever. So we were going to be the representatives of Virgin Galactic in Portugal. And I had to design and establish the project in Portugal. So it was a big challenge. And it gave me the opportunity of travel a lot to meet, great people. I met Sir Richard Branson. Actually, we had him coming to Portugal, to Porto, to open our office in Porto. It was, an amazing experience. I did part of the training that the future astronauts were supposed to do.
Wow.
Yes, and so it was really, really something, a great opportunity. And so then we started selling these trips at a price of around 200,000 US dollars. And in Portugal, we actually sold 5, which was great. Yes.
5, very good.
Yeah, the project is still going on, but they had some setbacks because, as you can imagine, space is not really an easy task, for some reason, always being, reserved for governments and national agencies. But, it was really a great experience for me. And from then, I was asked to run the communication departments of that big company in the tourism cruises in Portugal.
Wow. Well, Sergio, so with all this background, then we start to change, to see your changes in your life when you become finally a writer.
Yes, I always had that in the back of my mind for a very long time. And I guess every one of us, and it's very interesting, considering the time we are living now, which is a very peculiar, strange time around the world. We are fighting a war against, this invisible enemy.
Totally.
And it certainly gives us time to think on really the most important issues in life. That's what always happens, in times of wars. And for me, I knew I wanted to write for a long time. And I guess everybody has their own projects that they just put on, they just say, okay, I'll do that tomorrow, next week. next year. It can be, you know, writing a book, or go to a farm and start planting, starting your own vine, produce your own wine or whatever. We all have these projects in time, but for all different reasons, we just, you know, say, okay, I'll do that next tomorrow, next week, next day. And so with writing, I had the idea of this novel in my head for 20 years. And it was never the right time, because I had a very busy professional life. You know, I had no time at all to write. Writing is something very demanding. It's not something you can do on a part-time basis. Like you have a whole day in your office and then you get home in the evening and you will write. Forget it. It's not, I mean, it can work with some people, but it was not the case for me. So 6 years ago, for a set of reasons, you know, I had a change on my professional life, and I decided, you know what, this is the time for do what I always wanted to do. See if I can write that novel I have in my mind. So basically, I took a year off. It was like, you know, I said, okay, I'm going to take the year, like a sabbatical year, and I'm going to see if I can write that novel. It was, you know, because sometimes you realize maybe you're not taking your personal challenges because of fear, because you're afraid of facing your own challenges. And, you know, I guess it was also the same with me. So I said, okay, this is it. You know, I have a year. I'll give myself that year and see if I can write. In the end of this year, if I cannot do it, then I'll put it off my mind, you know, and I'll never think again about it. So it was how it started, you know. So I had the idea of the book I wanted to write, and then I started, you know, doing the research. It was like I knew I had to be very self-disciplined, you know, that I sometimes people ask me, how is your creative process? You know, how do you write? You know, writing is a job like any other job. You know, forget about, you know, sitting and waiting for the inspiration to come, because it doesn't happen like that. You know, you just have to sit in front of your computer, or if you're in front of your piece of paper, and you have to start writing. And you have to write every day and set yourself a goal and a schedule. So that was what I did. You know, I was working a certain number of hours, you know, like 6-7 hours a day on writing, you know, and from, you know, kind of 9-to-5 thing. And I needed to find the place, the perfect place for me to do that, because I knew that I had been trying that if I could write at home, and it didn't work for me, because writing is already something very kind of a lonely task, a lonely job. So if you write at home doing this kind of lonely job, you get too lonely. And for me, you know, I said, no, I need to write outside of my place. So I had to find a place where I could write. And, you know, I looked for different places in Porto, and I found this amazing location, which is the public Porto, Biblioteca Municipal do Porto, which is the public library of Porto, which is a beautiful and amazing building, 18th century building in the center of Porto, an old convent, and that was a museum, and then at some point became the library. And it's, you know, it's very quiet, it's very peaceful. Also, you have all the resources I needed, because I was going to write an historic novel. So I needed to have access to bibliography, to books, to documents, to papers. So it was the perfect spot for me. And I worked there for 1 year, you know, and eventually, to cut a long story short, I finished the book. in 1 year.
Very nice. Now that we know that you have already 3 books, tell me, Sergio, how is it to write, as you told us, or to have this experience of life that you have been for a long time there in this city that it's on the side, right, of this Douro River, that is one of the 3 bigger of the 3 big rivers in Portugal, right?
Yes, yes, we have north, you know, the bigger rivers are Douro, Tejo, and Guadiana, you know,
Uh-huh.
like kind of cross the country, north, center, and south.
Yeah.
So yeah, Douro is, I mean, it's really a very strong presence in the city of Porto, and that marked our history as well. But just let me tell you
Yeah.
something for those who have thought of writing, or you know, fiction or nonfiction or poetry. Of course, you know, it's not an easy process. And when I finished, you know, I was very, very happy that I did finish. You know, I was able to do, but then it became you know, it started an even more difficult thing, which was, now that I finished my book, I wish I could have it published. So it was a whole new chapter, trying to find a publisher and all that came along. But I think the most important, as in any challenges that you have, is
Uh-huh.
that you set a goal and you see if you can do it and if you can reach it. If you can, great for you. If you cannot, don't be hard on yourself, because you know there are other challenges. You know, if I didn't finish that book, you know, I just would say to myself, okay, I'm not supposed to be a writer, so maybe I should do something else.
Yeah, the idea that at least I tried, but I can yeah, I can put that in a situation where I know that I could or I couldn't do it, and that's it. Instead of always aiming that maybe in the future I'm gonna be able to, right? Well, now let's move on to the history, or to the historic part of your life, with this idea of, as I was asking you, with the Douro River, the Porto wine. Um, I find very interesting this idea that, as we were speaking the other day, when we met for the very first time, is that well, we share the same origin. In my case, my family comes from Spain, and also part of Italy, but the part that comes from Spain, it was very interesting for me to know that although nowadays the movies show us very interesting shows or movies of the Napoleon era in France, or the British having the 7 seas on their own, and all that, it comes very near our centuries, right? It's very interesting to know. And while when I give my walking tours in Buenos Aires, I always emphasize that there was a moment in the 15th century, especially, that the world was led, West world was led by these 2 big empires, that was the Portuguese Empire and the Spanish Empire. And I haven't seen many movies about that, but it's very interesting to know that was going on, and how they were trying to divide this world between both of them, right? So I wanted to ask Sergio, if is there anything that we can discover in the streets of Porto that shows that once Portugal was such a big empire?
Yes, absolutely. So I've always had this passion for history as well. You know, I loved history books. When I decided to write my first novel, I knew it was going to be an historic novel. So that's also why I decided to go back to the university and do a master in history, because I knew it could help me with the scientific approach, if you want, in the research for the books I wanted to write. And suddenly, the idea of the walk I had for the Airbnb experiences started as a project I did with students in the University of Porto, the Faculty of Letters, that we were setting up a kind of route in the historical spots of the historical center of Porto. Now, as you said in the beginning, we can trace the origins of Porto dating back to more than 2,500 years ago. And the very origins of the Kingdom of Portugal are in the north of Portugal. You know, actually the name Portugal was originated on the designation when the Romans came to the peninsula. So around 1 century before Christ, you know, they designated the side of the river Douro, which is now the city of Porto, they called Portus, meaning the port, and the other side of the river was Calais. There are, you know, different theories of the name Calais, but one of them is that it was the designation that the Romans used. So Portus on the side of Porto, and Calais, which means like the other margin, which is now Vila Nova de Gaia. So if you think Portus Calais, when you put them together, it's Portus Calais. And Portus Calais originated the name Portugal. So Portus Calais, Portugal. And that's one of the reasons, you know, people from Porto are very proud of their independence. They're very independent. They're very proud of their history, because we also say the name of Portugal was born here, which in a way it is true. So the city of Porto has a lot in terms of presence of all the history of the city that began more than 2,500 years ago. So the Romans was a big mark. Then in the 8th century was, you know, after the decline of the Roman Empire, we had the Moorish people coming from the north of Africa in the 8th century. So they invaded the peninsula, took over, swept, you know, across the peninsula, and they were stopped in they came in 711 and were stopped in the Battle of Poitiers in France. And from then on began what we call the Reconquest, meaning the fightings between the Christians and the Moorish. And the peninsula was the center stage of these wars. So the first Christian kingdoms originated in the north of the peninsula, you know, like Leon and Asturias, Leon, Castilla, and all these kingdoms. So the Christians were fighting the Moorish, and actually the origin of the Kingdom of Portugal was a small county as well, the Condado Portucalense. And so all these took like 7 centuries for the Moorish to go back to go out of the Iberian Peninsula again. So then we had the Kingdom of Portugal, we had Castilla and Aragon, which was the main kingdoms in Spain. Of course, the main force in the peninsula was Spain, that was formed from Castilla and Aragon by the Catholic kings. Yeah. Portugal always remained independent, except for a brief period of 60 years when the Spanish took over for dynastic reasons. So 15th century, 16th century, the Portuguese and the Spanish were truly the superpowers of the time. It was the Portuguese really that started the expansion, you know, go find new worlds, because you have to think, here in Portugal, we are like in the limit of Western Europe. And at the time, Portugal was the limit of the known world for Europeans. So there was the Atlantic Ocean, and nobody knew what was ahead. So the Portuguese started, the Portuguese started the expansion with the Spanish. Of course, we were the big competitors, but at the time, we splitted the world in terms of influence to avoid fighting wars. So who would rule what part of the world? And we drew a line. That was the Treaty of Tordesillas that divided the world in terms of two spheres.
Yeah.
So on one side would belong to the Portuguese, so the new discovered territories, and the other side to the Spanish. And that's the reason why you in Argentina were under the domain of the Spanish, and that only a part of South America, Brazil, was a Portuguese colony, and it's Portuguese speaking. All the other countries are Spanish speaking, because that line kind of divided South America.
Totally. I learned the other day, I learned that it was that line was drawn because it was the middle between Cabo Verde, the islands from Portuguese Empire, and the first islands that discovered Christopher Columbus, that is the Dominican Republic, right? The middle between those islands, they drew a line, and then I realized also, I kept on reading, and on the other side of the world, that line continued, right? It was just like the two sides, the splitting of an orange. This side is for you, this side is for me. It's incredible.
I mean, it's amazing. And to think it was the Pope. The Pope was like the arbiter, between these two superpowers. Think of it like the United Nations at the time. Totally. That was the arbiter to set. Now, something that's very interesting, at the end of the 15th century, when the Portuguese were starting the expansion, our expansion began in around 1420, with the conquest of Ceuta in north of Africa, the discovery of Madeira and Azores, the Atlantic islands, and we were like discovering the unknown coast of Africa. Now, the Spanish were sailing on a different direction with Columbus, who actually had come first to the Portuguese king to offer these services, but for several reasons, they didn't take him, and he offered his service to the Catholic kings, who accepted him, and that's how in 1492, he discovered again America. But you know what? He thought he was in India, because he was sailing west, looking for a passage to Asia, like the Portuguese were looking for that passage to go to India. Why India? Because there you had all the spices, all the products that mattered at the time, that were crucial for the commerce. And, when the discussions started to divide the world in two hemispheres, this is where it really gets interesting. The first line was drawn a bit more on the east side. But for some reason, the Portuguese insisted that this line would be drawn more to the west. Now, the theory goes, even though Brazil had not been discovered officially, it only happened in 1500, the Portuguese knew probably already of the existence of Brazil, so they insisted on that line to go more to the west side, so Brazil could be included, a part of that, which makes it really, really interesting. That's one of the reasons why I like this.
And also, I find very interesting, thinking in trying. I like very much about history, the picture of a moment, right? As we were saying, the picture of the world in the 15th century was this world divided between the Spanish and the Portuguese Empire. But I always find very interesting this idea that for example, I know that my way is, I am going that way, so the place where I want to go is that way, but I think that maybe if geometrically I am right, going this way, somehow I'm gonna be ending in that sense, in that place, right? It's like breaking a breaking mind experience.
Yeah, because I mean, at the time, scientifically, so in terms of science, we already knew the world was a sphere, even though there were still theories a flat planet. But
Even
so eventually you would turn all around the world if you kept on sailing on some direction. But just to answer what you first asked me, so in my walks, I traced some parts of the history of Porto and Portugal, and there's a very important landmark in Porto, which is Casa do Infante, the house of the prince, where Prince Henry, he played a major role in the history of the discoveries, of the Portuguese discoveries, was born. So it was him, like the brain, the mind that set the task of the Portuguese, you know, starting all these travelings. So we walk there and we go there, and I tell a bit to my guests about that part of the history. And it's by the way, it's a beautiful place to visit if you ever come to Porto.
Very nice, Sergio. So now we are officially introduce your experience that is called History with Porto as a background, right? So tell me, how was the process of designing, right, this walking through Porto?
Okay, so as I told you, you know, I first did some, I participated with some students in the University of Porto. We were tracing the medieval roots of Porto, and I came with this idea. It would be interesting to do, you know, like to map all the historical points within the historical center of Porto, which is not very big. You know, it's pretty much concentrated in an area next to the River Douro and Sé, where the cathedral is, and where you can really trace the origins and the development of the city of Porto. And then I heard that Airbnb was had these experiences, you know, and I thought, well, this might be an interesting thing to do. Also, you know, let's see if this can work out, if I like it, and if there's some side money attached, great. You know, so I designed the experience where I wanted, that's why I called it, you know, Discover Porto's Hidden Treasures, because in my travels, not only in Portugal, but all around the world, I always know that when you look at something behind the walls, behind the facade, there's a story. You know, there are people who live there. They have a story to tell. And sometimes you have those treasures that are hidden. So the purpose was to find and show and share some of these hidden treasures of the city of Porto with my guests. And then I so I knew the spots I wanted to show around, and I did a kind of a script, okay? But I also knew I didn't want this to be a very kind of professor thing, you know? I mean, I knew people just basically when you're traveling, you want to have a good time. So I thought, well, you know, I like to tell stories. I like to share, maybe I'll try to share these stories with my guests, but also in a kind of a relaxed way, and also adapt, of course, the walk to people, because you have all you know that by your experience, everybody knows here, you know, you have more people that are more interested in certain, you know, like in history or in, you know, in fait divers or in other things. So I also adapted it to the people that are doing the walk. But, you know, the basic thing was to share with them these small stories of Porto and of the history of Porto and Portugal.
Very nice, Sergio. When we were talking, I remember this the famous speech, you know, of Steve Jobs, that I think is very related with this, as you defined it the other day, that it like your unorthodox curriculum CV, with this idea that Steve Jobs said that you can't connect the dots looking forward, you can only connect them looking backwards. So you have to trust that the dots will somehow connect in your future. I guess it's very related with your experience of life.
I hope so. Now I think, you know, I had doubts in the past, but I think the reason where I am today, you know, was only possible because I had all these different experiences that brought me to this very moment.
Very nice. So, Sergio, let's open to the questions while we have reached our 45 minutes. I have already posted in the chat your experience in Airbnb and also your Facebook. If anybody wants to see a little bit more of what Sergio does in Porto streets. But let's look. You can ask. Everybody can ask with the microphone. I'm gonna first read something about in the chat that someone asked it here. The association asked, did Sergio have any writer's block over that year? If yes, how did Sergio deal with it?
Did I have what?
Any block over while you were writing?
Oh, I like the writer's block.
Yeah, the writer's block.
Yes.
Okay. Yes. I mean, when you write, the big challenge is what you say. You have the white sheet of paper or the white screen of computer. That's why I think if you want to write, and you can apply this to your experiences as well, I mean, in terms of Airbnb experiences, you have to think of a narrative. You have to think of a story. And there comes the inspiration. You have to look around you. And, you know, in my case, I had this idea of a love story for a very long time in my mind. I started from there. And then I thought, you know, I could have written that story in the present, but I thought it would have been much more interesting to put it on a certain historical period that in the case of my first novel was at the end of the 60s and the beginning of the 70s in Portugal, because that was a very interesting period of the Portuguese history. It was the transition between dictatorship and democracy. Mm-hmm. You had the end of the colonial war. So I started, you know, digging out that period. And so I already knew I had a context to write. So I never really had the writer's block. Also, because I was very much used to writing because of my journalism career. But it helps. So the best way to write is to practice. You have to write. And sometimes when I did have that writer's block, I just kept on writing, because even though I knew maybe that was not the perfect form, I could go back and review the goal. Because if you stop, you know, and you're just stuck with that writer's block, you know, you will never go ahead. So you have to keep on writing and think, okay, I will go back later on, I'll review the text. So the important thing is to have an idea of what you want to write, be it a story, you know, a script, whatever, that you know a starting point and you know an ending point. And so I knew how my story began. I wasn't really sure of how it would end. And then I knew it had to evolve so through different stages. So my advice, you know, if I can call it that way, is that if you do have that block, don't be petrified by it, you know, just sit and start writing. And I can tell you, the more you write, you will get better at it. You know, if you don't write, you will never get better.
Very good advice, Sergio. Here, Joanna asks that he was now looking around your experience in Airbnb, and she asks, what's Sergio's favorite hidden treasure in Porto?
Wow, that's a tough question. Because there are a few. I tried to put them all my favorite, you know, because it's a 3 hours experience, and I didn't want to make, you know, very long in terms of walking, because I didn't want to rush, you know, people through, you know, and just feeling rushed. So it's like just 3.5, it's approximately 4 kilometers that we walk. It goes up and down because the historical center of Porto goes up and down, so it can be a bit challenging. But it was enough to put the number of hidden treasures I wanted. But probably, if I would have to pick one, I think the most emblematic treasure of Porto, which ironically we don't visually see, is the heart of King Pedro. Okay, so who was he? Pedro was a Portuguese prince that lived from the end of the 18th century, and he died in 1834. So he was the son, the crown prince. He was the son of King Don João VI, John VI, and he would be King of Portugal, but he was the first emperor of Brazil. He declared the independence of Brazil. And then he had an amazing life. I mean, he really is the kind of hero, you know, romantic hero of the 19th century. So he became the first emperor of Brazil. He declared the independence of Brazil, then came back to Portugal again. You know that the royal family had fled Portugal because of the Napoleonic invasions in 1807, and they stayed in Brazil until 1821. It was the first time an European kingdom changed its capital from Europe to the New World.
To the colony.
Yes. Can you imagine? It was so all the court, all the administration changed from continental Portugal to Brazil. Now, of course, that was the big development of Brazil, you know, from a colony to a United Kingdom, which is something a lot of people don't know in Portugal, is that in 1815, Portugal became the United Kingdom of the Kingdom of Portugal and Brazil before Brazil being declared independent. But anyway, so Pedro then abdicated the throne of Brazil in his small son, who was only a child, 5 years old, for, you know, very specific reasons that had to do with Brazil, and came back to Europe, to Portugal, with a task. Because meanwhile, you know, as in all good stories, there's always a hero and a villain. Now, the hero here was Pedro. Of course, I mean, some people might disagree. And the villain was a younger brother he had, Prince Michael, who was an absolutist. So Pedro was a liberal and Miguel was an absolutist. And Miguel took over the kingdom of Portugal to become king when his older brother Pedro should have been the king, and he was a king, and he abdicated the right to the throne on a small daughter he had, Maria. So when he abdicated, I know it may sound a bit confusing, you know, shortening up, but so when he abdicated the kingdom as emperor of Brazil, he came back to Portugal to fight against his brother, to reclaim the right to his younger daughter, Maria. And it was a very hard time in Portugal because there was a civil war between these two factions, liberals and absolutists. So going back to your question, he came to Porto for strategic reasons. Miguel came with a big army from Lisbon, and they sieged the city of Porto for 1 year. It was 1832 to 33. It was a very, very hard time for the city of Porto, for the population, because they were under siege, they were being bombarded, you know. But if there's something the people of Porto are known for, is their pride and independence. So they stood by Pedro, and with the support of the population of Porto, Pedro won this war. Miguel went to exile, and Pedro could finally pass the right to the throne to his younger daughter, Maria. Now, in recognition of this support of the population of Porto, Pedro said, you know, when I die, I want my heart to stay in Porto, literally. So he died only 2 years later in 83. He died very young, I think 35 years old, 34, of tuberculosis. And so his younger daughter that had become Queen Maria was only 14 years old. So after he died, they took his heart out of his body, put it on a crystal vase to preserve it in formaldehyde, and is now inside a vault. I know, Elena, inside a vault in a church in Porto,
Wow.
the Church of Lapa. So you cannot see it because it's sealed, but the last time they showed it to the population, they opened it, this vault, they took this thing out. Actually, there's a very cool video on YouTube if you want to check that out, where you can see this very, very impressive ceremony. So for me, you know, the heart of Pedro lies in Porto. And you know what? Probably it's the most interesting hidden treasure of the city, because imagine someone leaving their heart to someone or to a city is the most personal thing you can leave. So and that's why the heart of Pedro is represented in a lot of images, and also in the shield of the city. You can actually see it on the basis of a statue in Porto. So for me, cutting a very long story short, that's the, I actually have here an image. Can you see this, the vase?
Yeah.
Okay, so this is a silver vase. Inside there's a crystal vase with a heart of Pedro. I know for a lot of people it's a bit traumatic, kind of morbid thing, but come on, isn't this such a romantic thing, kind of a hero thing? You know, I will leave my heart to the city of Porto. And he also gave the title to the city. So Porto had already a very long title, which meant very noble, old, ancient city of Porto. And he gave the title to the city in recognition of this support during the Civil War of Invicta. Now, Invicta, if you think of the Invictus Games, Invicta means invincible. So the title of the city of Porto, the official title is Cidade Invicta, meaning the invincible city.
Very nice. Well, let's see if anyone has one last question, because we have already reached the hour.
I know I speak a lot.
You know, it's super interesting.
Sergio and Esteban, thank you so much for the great interview. I love the unique way in which you intertwine the Sergio's life story with the history of Portugal.
Thank you.
My question for Sergio is, Airbnb online experiences are trendy now, and myself, I believe it's possible. I have a walking tour in Lisbon, history and culture. I very much enjoyed your stories, and I was able to make some connections. So I'm thinking myself about a potential online experience. Have you thought about it?
Yes, yes, absolutely. I've spoken about it with Teresa and other people. You know, the challenge here, there are some experiences that are more practical in terms of online experience. Like, for instance, if you have cuisine experience, you know, or a yoga experience, or even a wine tasting, a wine-related experience like Teresa has, it's easier to make an online experience. When you do a tour that basically you walk outside telling stories, it's much more difficult, because how are you going to do this? Will you just stay home? So I've been thinking a bit about this. You know, will you stay home with some, so I sure have lots of images I can show, you know, of all these characters and, you know, and things about Porto and monuments. But the thing is, will that be appealing, you know, for an online experience? I don't know, Elena. What's your thoughts on that?
I think that the main point is that we don't need to translate our old experiences into the online ones. like in your case, I would think, why not betting on your writing skills? Like have a chat with a writer, and the topic can be about the history of Portugal. I think you have a lot of authority through your work and your experiences. I would think more that way, in that vantage point.
Well, that's a great tip. Thank you. Have a chat with a writer. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
Think about it. No, that's a great tip. Yeah.
Well,
And especially because I have a lot of people, I do a lot of meetups with readers, also with students at schools. And the major question, Portugal is is a country of poets. Almost everyone, and it's very interesting because it's mostly poets, people who love to write poetry, and they come to me and, I have this that I've written and I would like to publish, and so there's like, hundreds of thousands of people that are writers or have written something. So yeah, Elena, that might be some of the challenges are putting your writing ideas on paper. Thank you.
That's awesome. I look forward to see something like that.
Sorry, Joanna, you wanted to say something, or?
Yes, because I agree with Elena. I think the main point here is to create something new, not to, and I mean, you can adapt yours, but the ideal is to create something new, since this is a whole new situation. And I think there was a webinar yesterday, and they were interviewing 4 people or 4 that did online experiences, and one of them he does 1 hour, and he just teaches people to do podcasts. So, and for you, with all your skills and and because you have such an interesting life, like it could be so cool that you did like 1 hour just to teach the basic skills to write a book, because there's people that always wanted to write books, but they don't know how to start. And even like the tips that you were telling us, that you were sharing with us about how to overcome a writer's block, that's really useful suggestions and ideas that you can share with others, and others would really appreciate that if you did that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Joanna. Also, because keep in mind, all of us here as Airbnb Experiences hosts, we are storytellers, in different ways.
Totally.
So we all tell stories in different ways. I think it's very interesting what you said, and yeah, maybe I can use that as well. And I just saw that Romeo, always the businessman, wrote that I should give a 10% commission to Elena in the future if I start with this online experience.
Not bad.
Romeo, president, please.
Commission, Elena.
Well, just to give an end to this, I am putting in the chat also my contacts in case you. First, thank you very much, Sergio, for your very interesting interview. It's very nice to understand. I like very much this way of understanding the present, looking backwards. So I guess in your case it's super clear how that pathway went through. I'm leaving in the chat my contacts of Instagram and also my webpage, just in case you think that there's someone in your head that maybe is worthy to make an interview. Can be yourselves also. And of course, we can do it in Portuguese. In this case, it was done in English just to make it more worldwide, and in Spanish. Okay. Also, I'm gonna read a suggestion from Luciano, that he's here from Buenos Aires, that he was saying that the history of how the kings of Portugal moved from Portugal to Brazil is really amazing and crazy. He read a book that is called 1808 from Laurentino Gomez, and it's very nice and an easy reading book. Of course, I'm gonna ask you now, Sergio, about the names of your books.
Okay, but before answering that to you, you know, it's just as a teaser, when the Portuguese court was in Brazil, the wife of the king of the time, who was a Spanish princess, Carlota Joaquina, because of the fact that the Spanish king had been imprisoned by Napoleon, she thought that might be an opportunity to set a foot in Argentina.
Wow.
And she did try that, but she wasn't successful. So otherwise, I guess the future of Argentina might have been slightly different. Who knows?
Who knows?
And so my books, you know, the first one, well, better I can show you them in a very speedy way. Excuse me for that. Okay, I should have known better. So this is the last one. It's the biography of the last Crown Prince of Portugal. It's called Afonso Bragança, Duke of Porto. So this is a history book. It's a biography. And then I have two historical novels published, which are part of a trilogy that tells the story of a family through the 20th century in Portugal. So the first one is this one, which is called, so this was published in 2015. So this was the result of a year of, you know, that famous year of work. It's called Até Amanhã e Não Morras, something like See You Tomorrow and Don't Die. And the sequel is this one. So that first one is set in the 60s and 70s in Portugal. This starts in the 80s with the story of the prime minister of the time then, Sá Carneiro. It's called The End of Time, with a beautiful picture of the Arco da Rua Augusta in Lisbon. I'm sure my friends from Lisbon recognize this image. So it's the back. And the third part that I'm starting to write now, it will be like a prequel, the origins of the family in the beginning of the 20th century. Hopefully, let's see if I can have it finished by the end of this year.
Very nice.
And Esteban, thank you so much for the opportunity of doing this talk. It was really, really great to meet you, to all the friends in Argentina, also in Portugal. Thank you so much. You know, I hope we can meet again, you know, in person, here in Porto, in Lisbon, wherever, or in Buenos Aires. You know, I'm very curious with your experience. And having a drink and a chat, it was great to have you guys here and to have the for you guys to have the patience to listen here. Thank you.
Very interesting, Sergio, very interesting.
Thank you very much. In my case,
thank you.
To you, Sergio, of course, and to Luciano, Teresa, and Elena, that they were the organizers, or they made all the arrangements to start this.
Yes, yes. Thank you. Thank you, Teresa. Obrigado, Elena.
Elena was asking who's next. Well, internationally, we want candidates. So whenever we have one, we're gonna tell you when's the next. Okay.
Okay.
Great. Yeah, I think you should definitely keep on doing this, because I mean it's a great experience. Yes.
Great. I think Luis was the one from Berlin, right?
Danilo was here with us.
Sorry. Sorry, Luis. I thought it was okay, because also maybe with Danilo from Berlin we can have another also interesting with another country, and also with Portugal. Okay.
And Giuliano from São Paulo. Giuliano, that is Italian. He used to live in Portugal and now lives in Brazil for the second time. He also loves history. He also did his experience in São Paulo. I'm going to send him a message. I think Giuliano is also be an amazing person to interview. He has lots of stories and he's quite passionate.
Very good. Well, feel free to contact me then. Well, hope you have a very nice day down there. Very nice weekend, right? Wherever you are, okay? Until next time.
Bye-bye. Have a nice afternoon.
Bye. Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.
Bye-bye.